This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. I have a special treat for you today. On Platemark, I've been interviewing people who occupy various roles in the print ecosystem, as I've described it. And at the same time, I have been with True Ludwig doing a History of Prints series. So if you haven't found those, you should go find them. Part of that story and about where we are in the chronology is to talk about this crazy process called Mezzotint. And who better to talk to than the woman who wrote the book, Carol Wax. Carol is an historian and also an artist. She's an incredible artist, painter, and draftsperson. And she is a tireless advocate for this unbelievably beautiful kind of intaglio printmaking. We asked her to come on, and I wanted her to do a part Mezzotint history, part technique, and also to talk about her own work. So it no surprise, with True on the call with us, it went on for a bit, and I'm splitting it into two parts. So this week you're getting the first part, and then the second part will come next time. Okay, let's see. Housekeeping. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. We record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. If you value the content that I bring you on Platemark, please consider becoming a monthly supporter of the pod. Go over to platemarkpodcast.com and hit the support and donate button, and you will help us all out. It's a labor of love, as I have said before, and your help would be truly appreciated. All right, buckle up. Let's get rolling. Carol Wax, it's so fabulous to have you. And True, thank you for joining us on this fine Sunday morning.
Thank you for asking me to join this august gathering, frankly. It's Carol Wax, the High Priestess of Mezzotint. I'm fanboying all over Carol Wax, the High Priestess of Mezzotint. That's what she told us to call her when I had her come down to Baltimore 20 years ago. And I still do.
Well, because people were calling me the queen, and I said, well, I'm not the queen, I'm the high priestess, so I stick with that.
Works for me.
I'm with it, yeah. All right, so our plan for the morning is to talk about the art of Mezzotint, of which you are the historian and expert. And then at the end, and possibly even split into a different episode, we're going to talk about you and your work as a contemporary Mezzotintor, tintress. Yeah, so
Mezzotint engraver.
Thank you. Mezzotint engraver. Well said. All right. So, yeah, I think people are just so mystified by Mezzotint. So we thought, who better to talk to than Carol about what the heck is going on with this stuff? So take it away, Carol.
Well, Mezzotint is a form of engraving. It's been traditionally called engraving because no acid is used. And it's similar to the way of drawing, where you take a white piece of paper, you cover it with charcoal, and you make it all black, and then to make the image, you erase it out. So it's a deductive or reductive process. The tool used to blacken a piece of copper is called a Mezzotint rocker. It's got a serrated blade with little teeth, and if you literally rock it over a copper plate, back and forth, it plows up little burrs. And if you do that in a million directions, consistently, you'll get a ground, not like an etching ground, a ground of burrs, a field of texture that feels like sandpaper, very fine emery paper. And if printed at that point with ink, it would hold ink everywhere. It's a sort of a hybrid between engraving and dry point then. And we print solid black, really like a velvety black. To make an image, you take tools that either shave down the textured ground, the burrs, and literally just shaving them away. And the more you shave away, less ink is held, the lighter the tone. Or you can take a burnisher and you can squash and polish the burrs. And to make white, you have to remove the ground totally. And eventually you get a plate that looks something like this. I don't know how to read the reflections. Here we go. And you read the reflections, and when you print it, wherever you have the most reflection, the ink's going to wipe off, and then where you have the least reflection is that matte ground. You'll get the deep blacks, and that's how it works. It's a sort of a hybrid between engraving and dry point. And it's all tonal, but you can obviously, add engraving or etching underneath it and do hybrid prints, mixed media it's called. And so it's a very direct method. It's very non-toxic because no acid is used, no grounds. And it's a little bit laborious to make the ground, but other than that, for me, not so.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have to snort here. A little bit laborious. Sort of like, let's just create heaven and earth on a plate. To have students have enough attention span to ground a plate continuously, perfectly, beautifully black, like you do, they go, and then this is going to take forever. And the answer is yes.
But some
Correct.
people, it appeals to them. For me, there's so many times I've been able to refine what I had intended from the sketch or the original concept or whatever through the rocking process. And so, and also what people don't realize, it's not just having a ground. It's part of the creative process because there's different gauge rockers, anywhere from 25 up to 150 teeth to the inch. There's different patterns you can use to infuse different textures. And I've used anywhere from that. This was a 25 gauge up to 150 for different purposes. So when you're working in color, instead of using transparent base, use a 150 gauge rocker. You don't have to add the base. And so, things like that, where the ground is actually part of the beauty of the process and creates effects that you can't get in any other medium.
In one respect, it does really feel like drawing on steroids. I adore the process. And when I show my students what we're doing, the ones that I've had for drawing, I said, now you understand why I teach drawing the way I do. Because as you said, you tone the surface and then it's a reductive. You erase away what you want to become white. And it is a beautifully meditative place to be.
Yeah, and if you enjoy carving, it's very sculptural because every Mezzotint is a bas-relief sculpture in that, you're raising the surface of the plate with the burrs, and then as you're reducing the height of the burrs, that you get down into valleys, and so it looks like a topographical map, and you can actually, if you were blind, you could feel what you were doing on the plate. So, a lot of people enjoy that carving process. I do.
Yep. Okay, you told me that you're completely self-taught. Now, can you explain to me what on earth got you into this and how long ago was it that you actually started mezzotinting?
Well,
Mezzotint engraving.
I always knew I could draw, but I didn't know how well I could draw. I knew I was one of these girls that drew horses obsessively. And then I went to high school. When I was in high school, my senior year, I took a portrait class, and we copied black and white portraits from magazines or whatever using ebony pencils. My art teacher, Mr. Zeitler, who I was still in contact with until a few years ago, was very supportive. And I had no idea until one day I did this gigantic drawing of John Coltrane that I really could draw anything. But by then I was a musician. I was already playing in high school semi-professionally. I went to Manhattan School of Music, and I went there for 4 years, graduated, started playing, professionally. And then that summer after graduation, I said, well, I want to do something with my art. A friend recommended going up to Lake Placid. They had a school there. She said, you like to draw? Learn lithography. So I applied. I showed pictures of my drawings, and I did some drawings in college too. And they say, oh yeah, come on up, but you got to take 2 classes. Why don't you take etching? I went, okay, whatever. And so I went up there and I learned etching, and I thought it was like the most horrible thing with acid, and when do you wipe the plate or warm the plate, and your hands got dirty. And so I didn't really like intaglio, but I didn't know about Mezzotint. I didn't even know about aquatint until the very end. And so came back to New York, was playing professionally, started doing prints as a hobby, mostly lithography at Pratt Graphic Center, which was an extension of, Pratt Institute in Manhattan. While there, I saw my first Mezzotint, and it really was like a bell sounding within me. But I associated it with still life, and I was doing portraiture. And I also associated it with intaglio, like, ew, messy printing and all that. So I was sort of reluctant. And then my life fell apart. I lost my apartment, lost my job, blah, blah. I moved upstate for a while and lived with my aunt because my uncle had just died. She needed help. And I would lock myself in the bathroom and draw just the things around me in pastel. And that got me away from working from photographs so I could control the light. And it got me making still lifes instead of portraits. And so then all of a sudden I felt like, okay, I had already been introduced to still life, the distilled images of Hamaguchi. And so I said, I think when I go back to New York, I'll start doing Mezzotint because I could rock the place at home. I didn't have to come into, the studio and work there. Copper is much more portable than large lithostones. And so I started doing Mezzotint, and Kazuhisa Honda helped me a little bit. He showed me how to wipe plates, and he told me something that made total sense to me. He said, use the scraper like a pencil. And from there, I just took off. And like maybe the third print I ever signed got into a competition at the Graphics Center. And Sylvan Cole from Associated American Artists saw my work there, asked me to be part of the gallery. And all of a sudden, I was both a professional flutist and a professional artist. And if I had stayed in music, I would have had to become a composer. I don't think I had the ear for that. So I wanted to be the creator, and I switched to art.
That's an heroic shift, frankly. And you looked surprised to know that Carol had been a flute player.
I had missed that part completely.
We've talked about that many times,
sure.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Carol and I also sort of connect, because I tend to use musical parallels a lot when I'm teaching, because I teach art history at the Peabody Conservatory of Music. So that's another reason why Carol and I are just like getting very excited.
And it makes sense to me because I think of art and composition the same way I think of music composition. There's an overall theme, there's a motif, there's repetition, there's modulation, there's inversion in composition and design, and that all comes out in my work. And so things that repeat and modulate crop up in my imagery very often, and I think of it in terms of music. I express myself that way, and because that's all my education.
I don't think we've ever, we've alluded to this connection to music, true, but I don't think we've ever really taught. I love how Carol's saying that the structure under which she's thinking about music directly, I feel like it rolls from music to art much more easily than art to music somehow. Music is more disciplined in its structure, and it maybe. Look at your face. My goodness.
I would just posit that the same kind of discipline and focus that's required to have someone learn flute and to play it in tune and with a great line that fills space with colors and textures would be really inherent. It's just, I can totally see the focus why Carol would move to Mezzotint as opposed to, as you say, hideously messy etching, which is what I feel about painting, because it's just gooey. It's not imprecise as compared to, what you can do on a copper plate.
Mm-hmm. I feel like everything I've ever learned about composition and art, I learned from Bach, Brahms, and Stravinsky, and Mozart.
Be still my heart.
Well, to this day, if you play the Mozart flute and harp concerto second movement, I burst into tears. So.
Oh.
Yeah.
There are places in some of my pieces that I can remember what I was listening to as I was carving it. And I remember my sister making me this is old technology, a mixtape that was entitled Music to Carve By. And it was, I used to listen to a lot of Gregorian chant because it's that focus and that's the meditational space where that tool hits the plate. It's a magical, it's like a downbeat. It's an ictus. It's that moment.
Thing is, I have no art education as far as art history and all of that. And so when I began writing the book, The Mezzotint, History and Technique, it was difficult for me to figure out what art was part of the Romantic movement, the Classical movement, Baroque, Rococo, all of that, because in music it came later. And so by the time you're in classical art, you're still in sort of Baroque. Bach is still, doodling away. And so, and I don't mean that derogatory, but, and, so for me, I didn't know what to do about reorienting myself because, again, I was oriented in a music life. And so my father had the complete set of Will and Ariel Durant History of the World books. And starting, just before Mezzotint was invented until, its demise as a reproductive industry, I read the entire series. And that reoriented me, but it also, learning history through where I knew I needed some, everything to tie into Mezzotint was really illuminating because it showed me how everything is connected. And that's what I love about you, True, is that you connect the dots all the time in art history to what really matters and how things happen. It's not in a vacuum. And so learning this, I said, okay, so the same forces that affected these guys 300 years ago, 250, whatever, how many years ago, are affecting artists today. And knowing about these forces, these social, cultural, industrial, financial, political forces that have shaped how the Mezzotint industry came about, how it evolved, are still affecting us. Papers change. You ask anybody, oh, paper sucks now, inks have changed, ink manufacturer, there's all these online groups like, hey, I got a bad batch, whatever. All of these things and knowing what your materials can do, how they evolved, will teach you how to correct the problem. And so basically, as I was writing the book, it was like all the president's men, follow the money. So in shaping everything, Mezzotint as an industry, I was able to sort of then figure out how it affected the art. And it's still, all these forces are still affecting us creatively. And what do you make? How does it sell? What do you do with it? What reason do you make this kind of imagery? What shapes you as an artist? And so that was really how I shaped the book. And so I'm hoping that artists will read the history because there's so much relevant information that we can still use today. And so every once in a while, I think, oh my God, my work was rejected from this and that and the other thing. And then I look at John Raphael Smith, my guy, my go-to guy. And he never got into the Royal Academy. He never did all this, got this prize or that prize. Nothing ever happened for him like that. But, oh my God, what a talent. What an interesting guy. What a body of work.
Sometimes when I'm teaching class and the students are reticent to speak up, somebody will say something and it's just that ding. I said, if we were talking on Zoom and I had a little halo I could ding, put over your head, the way you absolutely package that, it's absolutely the truth. It's how the art history is a complete focal point of all of those coexisting forces. And I think, and you also, an autodidact after my own heart, the Durant series of art history is just so exquisite, and he also weaves that into its time. I think it's time for a complete reprint of that entire cycle. Will Durant is great.
I mean, it wasn't even, and it's also funny. He made history funny.
Yeah.
My favorite funny things that I just never stopped laughing about was he was talking about Bach and he was talking about, Handel's having nervous breakdowns and Bach had all these children. So he had, these pressures. But then he talks about Telemann and he says, so everything was going great with Telemann, except that his wife preferred Swedish army officers, and I thought that was, maybe it was Swiss, I can't remember, but, it was, and I thought that was the greatest line. It's like, oh, poor Telemann,
It's lovely and offhanded. He's got such a wit. It's just absolutely delightful. Yeah.
Right. And the thing is, as printmakers, I think learning about history that we come from a long tradition, and those traditions really are handed down, no longer obviously through the apprentice system, but through the collaboration setup of how so much printmaking is done. I think it's very important to have that background. I found it very inspiring. After I wrote the book, my work changed. I got the guts to do large 2-foot by 3-foot plates. I was taking out more of the background. I had the confidence and the drive to really step up to to what these guys were doing, and I still find them very inspirational. I have a fabulous Valentine green just hanging in my bedroom that I wake up to every morning, and I go, wow.
Knowledge is power. Absolutely. The more you learn about your own history, it really does. And I remember noticing the scale of your work had expanded. When was the first edition of the Mezzotint?
I started writing it in 1985, and it took about 5 years to write. The first edition was published in hardcover in 1990 by Abrams and jointly with Thames and Hudson. And then in 1996, the paperback came out. I was able to make minor changes. And then it sold out. It was sort of, just nothing was happening with it. And a few years ago, about 3 years ago or so, my editor, Robert Morton from Abrams, who was no longer with Abrams, called me up and he said, "Where do you stand with Abrams and the book?" And I said, "Dead in the water." And he said, "I got a publisher for you." And so Shafer was great because they allowed, because of technology, they could just scan the whole book, move it into, there was a program that moved it all into movable type. So if I said, it would really help to have an illustration here, what a print seller's mark looks like, imprint, a chop. And they go, "Oh yeah, put it in." I was like, "We'll just move the type around." And it's like, whoa. And so they allowed me to make a lot of changes. They also laid it out beautifully so the photographs are more matched with where the text is, so it flows better. They allowed me to make clarifications in the history section, update it so no longer calling Indians is now Native Americans, that kind of thing. So a lot of revisions there. And then I ripped apart totally the technical half of the book, because after 30 some odd years of teaching, I could see where the confusions were. I could slow things down, divide it up into sections, give little names to things like 3 kinds of, basic rocking patterns, that kind of thing, and name them. But the other thing was that when I wrote the book, originally, it was supposed to be a 45,000 word book with an 8,000 word introduction. And then when I handed it in, it was 25,000 words of history. And they said, "Well, slow down, explain this. This is all very interesting." I said, "It's going to go long." Let us worry about that. So to their credit, they handled it. And the history half is about 100,000 words. So I thought, okay, well, now I have a deadline to hand in the technical half of the book. And they'll do the same thing. They'll say, "Slow down, explain this, rearrange it, la, 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 la." And no, they sent it to the typesetter. That was my first rough draft. And so I was able to now, finally, after 30 some odd years, reorganize, regroup, explain, and update. And so I'm so much more pleased. Also, they used a great quality paper. The reproductions are fabulous. I'm really, really happy.
Can I be your shill? I'll be your shill.
Yeah. I'm holding up the 1996 soft cover, and True's holding up the new edition.
And for anyone who wants to buy this book and get a signed copy, it will probably cost a small fortune to ship. So we printed up these ex libris self-adhering labels that you can put your name, because we found out that one of our biggest markets are teachers whose students have stolen the book. So they can put their name here, and I can sign it and date it here, or put a little dedication.
Listen, I'm gonna have to. I have my copy, Carol, and I need my ex libris.
Awesome.
Because it's true. Every book I've ever had that it's, Ludwig on the cover, the back cover, inside, because they walk. And the other thing, though, was my first edition of the book was in soft cover, so I could lay it flat. And it was so beat to heck that, it was time for a new edition. And it's true. Everything matches up so much more effectively. And the slowing down makes it so much easier to translate it.
Yeah, and it looks crisp. I mean, Shafer Publishing was fantastic. I can't say enough about them. They did a great job. Ian Robertson, my editor, was phenomenal to work with. I have no complaints at all. I mean, it was just an amazing experience, but it was out there in the ether. I mean, I never met anyone. So it's kind of, it was a great opportunity, and I'm very grateful.
How long did the process take from initial invitation to publication?
To tell you the truth, I'm not sure. Maybe 2.5, 3 years. It was an interesting process.
Do you want to, doesn't have to be hugely long, but dive into the history and how Mezzotint developed as an art form and what made it die?
Well, I mean, it actually played a very important role in art history because it was the first technique where you could have true continual tones and could replicate brush strokes because of that. So, I mean, of course, in the beginning, there was Burin engraving, which, I mean, I'm the biggest fan of Goldsmiths in the world, but, you know, it's a system of cross-hatching and yes, and all of that. And I love calligraphy, so of course I love Goldsmiths. And then you had etching, but there was no, aquatint hadn't been invented yet or anything like that. So in 1642, this German soldier on leave from his duties as a kammerjunker, assistant to a nobleman in Cecil, was in Amsterdam, and he came up with this idea of working with, it looks like he was working mostly with dry point and roulettes. And so it was always assumed that he was not using rockers. But in the very first print he ever did, his name was Ludwig von Siegen, I found rocker marks. Very distinct, very clear rocker marks. And it makes sense. If you're experimenting, making, you know, dots and burrs and all that, that if you have tools from, say, the bookbinding or woodworking field, that you would try each tool. Obviously, the rocker made deeper burrs, and so he only used that in one area and toned it down. And so he was working mostly additively and working deductively to correct mistakes, toning down those rocker marks. And he published this print of the Landgravine in Pescasel, 1642. And he did a few other prints, but he didn't seem to have spread this information about Mezzotint very far. But about 12, 15 years later, whatever it was, he was traveling around. And while he was not a nobleman, he was raised with noble people. And he had a very easy relationship with people in a higher class. And so he ran into Rupert of the Rhine, he ran into Jan Thomas of Ypres, he ran into Theodor Caspar von Furstenberg, all these people who were noblemen, but they had no land because the older brothers had it. And so they were all sort of amateur artists. And so this information about Mezzotint got spread. Now, either von Siegen wanted to curry favor in the courts and spread this information, or he may have just, you know, said it to them personally, like, no, I'm doing this thing, but they were interested. And so Rupert, in particular, hired the Flemish artist, Weimaraner Vaillant, and they worked on this technique. And what they realized was the importance of the burr. And so they were experimenting in different ways to get burred grounds. And von Siegen as well, this is not really understood, was increasing his use of the grounds to work purely deductively. Basically, what happened was the monarchy was restored in England. Charles II was a cousin of Rupert. He invites him over, and Rupert spreads Mezzotint in England. Why was England so receptive? Because Burin engraving had arrived 100 years later in England than on the continent. So these people were like, oh, this is really cool. And they're experimenting with files and all kinds of things. You know, how was this done? And Rupert was really an interesting guy because he was into metallurgy. He invented a way of tempering steel. So he was making better rockers. And then Louis XIV invaded the Netherlands, and the artists flocked to England where the economy was good. One of them was Abraham Bleudeling, and Bleudeling worked with Rupert, and they made a more systematic way of grounding plates, possibly with these better rockers. And all of a sudden, these beautiful grounds appear. And artists like Godfrey Kneller and Lely and all these people were there. They wanted their works reproduced this way, especially with portraiture. You could get those soft skin tones. You could get, fur and satin and all that. And it took off. It became mainly a reproductive process. It became mainly for portraiture in the beginning. And it became quintessentially such a British craft that the government and the publishers ran for government positions, protected the Mezzotint industry with tariffs, with import taxes, all these things, copyright laws. And also Mezzotint helped separate intaglio printmaking from the book trade because Mezzotint was much more fragile. So the concept of a limited edition starts to appear because the plates broke down so much more easily. And so it really became a thing in England. And then, of course, England and the American colonies, how would you get an art education in America? There was no one to study with. There were no books. There were no art schools. What would you do? The Mezzotints imported into America. John Singleton Copley, his stepfather, was the first Mezzotint engraver in America. So, Copley, it's well documented that he copied Mezzotints exactly in his paintings, and he just put on someone else's face. So copyright laws, allow, what are you going to do? Come after me, right? But some people would buy, a client would buy a Mezzotint and give it to the artist and say, paint me like this. And so dressmakers could copy the latest fashions coming in on these Mezzotints. So it really, there were far-reaching uses for Mezzotints, and yet, who's heard of it? So it's got a very interesting history.
I just recall the part where Mezzotint was still so highly prized in Britain, and they were so disgusted and disdainful of lithography that they had banned an import. I think it was on the stones even to England, and don't even allow those into your homes. It was very British.
They were very discerning collectors also. So they wanted the early impressions. If a print was hand-colored, they assumed it was from a worn plate, the impression, so they wouldn't buy it. Whereas in France, they loved color, they loved things light, and so all the worn plates would be colored and shipped to France, where they loved that kind of thing. And so there were many, many uses for the plates, and the plates themselves were exported. So if, say, Lord so-and-so was very popular in England and you had 200 prints of him, and then all of a sudden something happened and no one liked him anymore, they would sell the plate to, say, someone in Holland who would remove the face and put someone else's face on, and all of a sudden became General so-and-so. And so, the plates were very valuable. Yeah, there are some plates, there's like 5 or 6 different versions of this same horse, and they change the arm background and the face, and they'll take out the little, African page boy, and there's, all the plates are altered over and over and over. And it's easy to make alterations in Mezzotint, much more so than with burin engraving, where you're just carving into that plate, and to get rid of a mistake takes hours and hours and days. And so you could easily correct mistakes. So it also made it easy for engravers and artists like Joshua Reynolds to collaborate, saying, oh no, I want this better, that better, or the really neurotic relationship between John Constable and David Lucas, where they were working together and like do this, do that, and push this, push that. And so David Lucas actually just became the hands of Constable, and sometimes hands remotely, because the instructions were sent through mail, messenger. And so, there was a lot of collaboration. And because certain costumes or hairdos or whatever looked better in Mezzotint if they were toned down, and people had 3-foot-high hairdos back then, Joshua Reynolds would change how he would paint someone so that it would look better in a Mezzotint. And so it changed fashion. Mezzotint changed fashion. Mezzotint changed so many things at the time, especially during its really golden age, which is, we're talking about second half of the 1700s. It's a real thing.
It's funny, our illustration majors now a critique I used to make with a friend of mine when we would walk through galleries in New York and say, the thing on the wall does not look nearly as good as the reproduction of it. And that was the point, is that it needed to look good in reproduction. It wasn't that it was gorgeous unto itself. And it's very true when you think about, I could completely see artists like, well, what's it going to look better? We can fix it in post, those kinds of things. It's the same way still today.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, now it's kind of like, is this painting done? Is it not done? How will it look as a JPEG? And it's like, whoa, it looks so sexy because it's backlit, and I can fix this and that in Photoshop. But it's the same process, the same creative concerns. And it's still going on today, just slightly different. Also, because Mezzotint inherently emphasizes chiaroscuro. It could address issues that, the linear processes couldn't. And then you would get someone like Joseph of Derby, who grew up in a society where mezzotints were everywhere. He looks at these prints and look at his work. It's all about the lighting. And so, and he copied mezzotints. He took Thomas Fry's mezzotints. He said, I need a face that goes like this. And he copied Thomas Fry's portraits of a man head tilted. And he puts it in, showing an experiment on the air pump. And so, it's all of this, it all just rolls and rolls and develops. And then, of course, you hit the age of steel and everything changes again because technique changes, process changes, collaboration changes, materials change, the discovery of natural gas in America. All of a sudden, we've got these deep, black inks, we can compensate for the shallow grounds on the steel and blah, blah. And Perkins and all these people with the invention of, what do you call it, case hardening. You could work on steel and, have different qualities of steel. And some plates were made just for Mezzotint. The Mezzotint guy said, we need steel that does this. And they would do it. And so, again, it was such an important industry. And the creative part falls with that. So creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum, ever. My students would always say, well, I don't have an idea. I said, it's not going to come to you. Just move your hands. Just move your hands. It'll come. When photography was invented, and you could reproduce work that way, Mezzotint kind of fell by the wayside. Also, the introduction of art schools. So you didn't need to spend 7 years as an apprentice. Your daddy didn't have to pay for you to study with Valentin Green or something. So all this information that these guys had just got lost for so long. And why would someone work with a reproductive engraver who might be difficult, might have a, schedule, when you can just have a photograph or a photogravure made? And they tried to make the photogravures look like mezzotints, So, it kind of fell by the wayside, and then it got taken up by the etcher-painter movement. And you get people using it, Joseph Pennell, and then, later on, Reynold Weidenauer. And then when Hamaguchi, Yozo Hamaguchi started doing mezzotints, they were reproduced everywhere, but they didn't reproduce the texture of his grounds. So people would see fruit floating in space, and they go, I'll do that. And, but they didn't see what he was doing with the grounds. So I'm Eurocentric, in that I impose light on a subject and see what happens. Hamaguchi had open grounds and he would layer them in colors, almost pointillistically, like a tapestry, that allowed the light of the paper to come through. So the glow, the light was from within. Even though his work is misunderstood to this day, I think. So many artists were inspired by that, and Avadi was also working. It sort of started a generation between all the print shops in the 70s that opened up, Lower East Side Print Shop, Pratt Graphic Center, which became Manhattan Graphic Center, and Bob Blackburn. Bob Blackburn is amazing. And all these places, and the information was, all these cross currents in the 70s, and New York was, was a really gritty place at the time. But there was so much happening, and I learned so much. And then 1980, I started saying, okay, that's it, Mezzotint. So there you go. And now there's this new golden age. There's so many people, amazing artists doing Mezzotint now. I mean, of course, you have the people like, Art Werger, Fred Mershimer, Craig McPherson, Judith Rothschild, so many. I can't even name them. And newer generations, Jacob Crook, oh my God. And so it's evolving again, and it's really beautiful to watch.
True. I'm delighted. I'm basking in the thoughts of chiaroscuro and how things just make that complete turnaround in a completely foolish parallel. It's strange to watch my students getting excited about cassette tapes and LPs, where they were completely dead technologies. And you remember having to get rid of vast walls of your entire, record collection and feeling terrible about it. And now it's back. And it is thrilling to see how many mezzotints are out there. And in one respect, I think it was the Japanese mezzotinters that kind of caught my attention there for the most part for quite a little while. But now it's, like Julie Niskanen. Anne has a glorious etching by Julie Niskanen, who was a member of Washington Printmakers Gallery for a long time. There are people still just lurking out there. Charlie Ritchie, who is, he says he rocks his plate as a way to unwind after work. And I can completely understand that, And I remember you having this very 37 degrees of how it all has to rotate and whatnot.
I don't go by numbers. I really don't. It really depends on the quality of your copper. Copper is not just copper. It depends on what kind of rocker you have, your technique, how the spacing. There's so many factors. How wide is your rocker? So, I kind of aim for 36 directions, but sometimes I'm done at 32, 28, and and people say, well, can you over rock a plate? No, because eventually it would take so long. I tried it. And what happened, a little 2x2-inch plate, when I was writing the book, I did his research, and I rocked and rocked and rocked. And what happened was, eventually you pound down what you've brought up. And because as you're rocking, you're also annealing or tempering. I can't remember, the plate. You're changing the surface structure of the copper, the crystals, copper crystals. And what happens is it's like a paper clip. You can bend it, and then whoop, it broke, right? So what you're doing is you're changing it, and it becomes more brittle. And once you've really pounded down those burrs, you think, well, I'll just bring them back up again. They don't come back up. And you just end up with this little bumpy, pebbly kind of surface. But to do that, oh my God, it takes hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. But because you are changing that surface of the plate, Mezzotint is far stronger than dry point. Dry point, you're drawing a line, you've got a burr pulled to the side, and it's going to collapse after 10 prints if you're lucky, if you can get 10 good ones. But with Mezzotint, you're really hardening that copper. And sometimes I combine Buren engraving with Mezzotint. I'll do the whole Mezzotint, and then I'll engrave through the plate where I want lines because it's too hard to scrape around them. Fred Mershimer can do it, but I don't have the patience. But if you're engraving through that plate, once you've spent 2 months on a Mezzotint and you're doing all this engraving, one slip and you're really screwed. But the thing is, because you're changing the crystalline structure of the plate surface, it's almost like engraving through an 18th or 17th century plate, which has been, poured from hot copper as opposed to the cold rolled copper we have today with grains and everything. It's actually a really nice experience if you can hold your breath, that long to make a line that long with a Buren. So it's not as fragile as people think, and it's got a lot of advantages working that way.
That question of how many prints can one pull off a Mezzotint plate that hasn't been steel faced in your life, and you do all your own printing still, yes?
I have worked with Jennifer Melby when I didn't have a large press. I now have three Charles Brand presses. I have the one you see here is 16-inch wide, and then I have my 28-inch wide. I'll show you my studio. So inking counters, and then there's an alcove with my 28 wide press, and my engraving corner, and then there's a bank of flat files along here, and I've made a cage or a room out of steel shelving. to hide away all the cardboard and crap. But so I worked with Jennifer Melby. When I moved to Peekskill, I had this space that I could finally get a press, big one. So now I do print all my large plates. Jennifer was great to work with. She was my hands when I needed them. Yeah, so now I print my own stuff. What was the question? Oh, how many?
How many? Yeah.
This is going to sound like a cop-out, but it depends on the quality of the copper, how you rock the plate, your gauge rocker, what kind of paper you're using, the condition of your blankers, what kind of ink are you using, how are you wiping, the kind of pressure you're using, the diameter of the roller of the press even can make a difference. What else? The paper, I use mostly German etching paper or copper plate, a Hanwell copper plate, because I like a very, very, very lightly sized paper. And also I like an off-white paper. And the German etch, I really feel gives me a beautiful impression. And I can tone the ink. I can go bluer or warmer to create like a feeling of rust, because I do so much old machinery, or to really increase the contrast with the bluer ink. And when I was writing the book, I printed plates all identically with different kinds of paper. And I went over to Thomas Ross and Son in London to see how they reacted. Because I asked, what do you print on? Because they were still printing at the time plates from the 16, 17, 1800s. And they don't have that paper anymore. So what were they using to imitate it? And they just wouldn't tell me. It was a big secret. So, but I laid out all the different papers that I had done the experiment. And I said, okay, one by one, all the printers came in and they said, what's the best impression? Not one picked anything other than the German etch. And I didn't identify them. They all picked German etch.
Can I ask this is a total shop nerd question, because I'm a big fan of German etch, and Anne, poor thing, lovely thing, has helped me pull my ridiculously huge Aquatint stuff, 24 by 36, and I always print on German etch because the color and the heft of it is quite lovely. How long do you soak your German etch?
No, because it's so lightly sized, it's almost water leaf. It's also 25% high alpha cellulose. It's not 100% cotton, but it's archival, obviously. What I do now is I have a sprayer, just a hand sprayer, and I put the paper on. I have a glass table there, I think you saw in the middle of my studio, and I put a big piece of plastic tarp out, and I spray the paper, and I wrap it and just do a damp pack. And you don't need to soak. I'm constantly reading online, all these groups on Facebook and stuff. Oh, I soaked my paper overnight, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, why? It is mostly to get out the sizing. You just want to make the fibers more relaxed and, pliable. Before I had the table, I would just run a sheet of paper underneath the faucet on one side, put it down, this one, put it down and make the damp pack. So there's really, if you're using lightly sized paper, there's no need to soak. If you're using something much more heavily sized, maybe then you want to soak out some of the sizing, make sure everything's really soaked. But even then, I would probably do it 20 minutes and then do a damp pack. So, for what I do, it's just the damp pack. And I have a big tray, but now it's just filled with paper scraps, and my dog likes to take out. She thinks Reeves BFK is fun to play with. So
I told you it was a totally geeky question, Anne, but you see, there are going to be printmakers and Mezzotint engravers that are going to go, really? Yeah. This is great stuff.
Well, the other thing is that in the book, people don't realize it's not just about Mezzotint. There's a whole history of printmaking papers in there, more than you'll find in any general printmaking book. I will say that. How the fibers formulas changed, how the process changed, what to look for, how it changed the prints, how was this kind of problem encountered, like, for example, when they lost all the sailing ships and all these things, and they didn't have enough linen to make good linen, with long fibers and all that. They switched to other papers that were not receptive to Mezzotint. How did they compensate? Well, Chincolet. So, all of these things, how come this evolved? How can you use it? How will it inspire you in your work? And I think the more technique and material knowledge you have, the more you have something that can, like doing scales when you're playing the flute, if you have that facility. And then when it comes to doing Stravinsky, you've got it. The fingers are there. And you can do something creatively or musical with it, as opposed to just, play the notes.
It's fascinating to think, for those of us that are working in the real world in printmaking, there's no way you could track down certain kinds of papers that we don't think exist anymore. But actually, I was working on a project with the National Gallery of Art, and I was training the paper conservator and the print curator in how to print aquatint. And because it was the National Gallery, they wanted to find the most authentic paper. And because they had the National Gallery budget, they found the most authentic. They found a paper maker out in some tiny village in France that the family's been making this paper since 1349 or something ridiculous like this. That you even had to send. You couldn't fax anything. You couldn't do anything digitally. It had to be done by snail mail. But you can feel the difference. Just the heft of this paper. It's amazing to even see they allowed a photograph of the fellow pulling the sheet, and it's this, clapboard barn, and you can tell the wood is older than the hills. You can tell it's like one of those tiny little pockets of perfection that hasn't died yet.
But the fibers, were they in that mill? Were they mashed up in the Fourdrinier machine, or were they stomped?
So here's the question. I didn't have to know that because the paper conservator figured all that out, and
because
that's her nook.
The longer fibers, and that's what makes why you could have thinner paper that was stronger back then. Once they switched to the Fourdrinier machine, everything got cut short, and then they had to add sizing and make it thicker and all that. And then they had to change the screens. The screens changed because you went from a laid, screen to a woven screen, like a window screen, and they had to drain. And so how do you drain those, with all the thicker papers and blah, blah, blah. All of that had to be worked out because originally the Mezzotint guys, they all printed on French paper. And for the longest time, they held out. And there were whole contests held who could create the best paper in England that imitated the French paper. And so it became a huge deal. And I don't think they ever really imitated it. But for the longest time, any, document that came that was really, really important had to be really archival, really, on the best paper came from France because they switched later from the stompers to the Fourdrinier. Is that what a machine thing that ground up instead of, stomp the fibers? And so, all of that ties into how documents, how money's made. So what's the secret in making money? I think it's the longer fibers. And so, all of that, because it always comes down to the paper. And, when I asked my students when I was teaching, I'd say, well, how many of you own prints? Nobody. I said, what's in your wallet? It's a print. It's an engraving. So, all of that, it all ties in. And so the needs of these artists, and, it was an industry, really changed how other industries, everything was connected, everything.
So, Carol, back to the idea of a bazillion factors determining the size of your editions. Can you start the printing process knowing all of those factors and establishing the number before you start, or does it develop and you say, I can't get more than 30, I'm going to stop?
That's exactly what I was going to ask. Have you ever made a plate where you had hoped to get more out of it, but the plate just wouldn't take it?
Steel facing. So very early on, I started steel facing my plates. I guess, when I was young, I thought, okay, well, maybe 25 would be good. And then I thought, well, yeah, but if I get really famous, maybe one day, if I become the next Tamaguchi, maybe 50. And then I'm like, oh, fuck it, 75. And so, so for the longest time, 75. Sometimes they sell out, sometimes they don't. There are some I go, oh, I didn't like this one, 50. And then it sells out just like that. I'm like, oh, stupid. But my plates have always traditionally been steel face, not only because of the edition size, but because the ink wipes off the steel better than the copper. And so that's a consideration. Also, you need more pressure to print a mezzotint than any other intaglio plate because it's like an English muffin, nooks and crannies and everything. But you got to really suck that ink out. So I want to make sure I have that. Fred Mershimer won't print an unfaced plate, even his proofing. He'll face the plate. He'll have it removed if he wants to make corrections, get it refaced because it's easy to take off. I think that's a little bit much, but something happens. There is a subtle change in the plate with the steel facing. Sometimes it sort of brings it all together. I don't know. I don't face anymore because I'm getting to the point where it's like, I don't really want, I'm old enough that I don't want all these impressions in my drawers when I die. So I'm scaling down. And also Jennifer Melby was still facing my plates. She's now not facing anymore for people. Sometimes I'll use Lothar Osterberg, because he's up here in the Hudson Valley with me. But for the most part, I make, unless I'm working in color, because color shifts on copper, and I'm no longer facing. I'll just do an addition of 25 and say the hell with it.
Quick question for the uninitiated, because there are going to be people out there who have no idea what the heck steel facing is or how it's done. And for those of us who actually had to remove steel facing, and it was very terrifying because I had to take it off of Peter Milton's plates for an exhibition that Ann and I put together. To me, it just, I was told that I needed to be very careful because, of course, if you're removing steel facing, you could damage the actual copper image, because it would actually start to etch what you would had to use. This is from Bob Townsend. So tell us, if you would please, from, as my mom would say, from fart to stinish, how do you do steel?
Well, once the plate's finished and you don't want to make any more alterations to it, there is a solution in a tank. And it's electroplating. It's like taking cheap jewelry and gold plating it. It's the exact same process, except you're using iron. It's really iron facing. And so you get the purest iron ingots you can possibly get that are on one side of the tank, and then your plate's on the other. And there's wires soldered to the back of the plate, and everything's attached to a rectifier or a battery of some sort. And I can't remember if it's the anode or cathode or which way the molecules go, but the molecules from the iron ingots gravitate through that solution to the copper and coat it. And it's a microscopic, coating. It doesn't protect it for a million times, but consider that the Jolly Flat Boatman plate was steel on steel, and that produced 10,000 impressions. So iron can protect, but it's a partial protection. You can scratch it off. You can burnish it slightly if you want to make a small correction, but you could rub it off. And it will eventually collapse for 200 impressions. But before that happens, any sign of wear, any sign of anything happening, you can remove it very easily with like a 10%, I think, or 1% or 2%, whatever it is, solution of nitric acid. And it just magically comes off and instantly just disappears. And you
It's terrifying. It's terrifying. I mean, on Peter Milton's big old plates, and Bob Townsend had told me it's 3%, but because those plates are so cumbersome, and how do you get that in and out, and you have less than 60 seconds. Come on. It's just
like 10 seconds. It's never been more than 10 seconds, even with a very, very, very. I had to photograph for the back of the book this plate, which was already steel faced. And so Lothar gave me a solution in a little peanut butter jar or something of weak acid, and I did it, and it came right off. So, it's not a problem. And Fred Mershimer, because he won't print on copper, just, takes it on, puts it off, takes it on, puts it off. So it's pretty safe to do.
So as you say, it's all connected. Then let's think about when the technology of steel facing came about as a part of the Industrial Revolution, and what the machines were, and electricity, and all of that, so that Fred Mershimer or Carol Wax can have their prints go much longer on this arcane antique kind of a process. It's all connected.
Well, when steel facing was invented. And also it happened at the same time there were already plates of steel to work on, which changed the technique, how people worked. It became much more collaborative because a lot of stuff was etched into the plate before, because the burrs were so short on the steel plates. they would actually advertise some prints as having been engraved on copper so that they seemed much more precious, more limited, as opposed to the steel plates, the large steel plates of Landseer stuff and stuff that was, they would print by thousands and thousands. And so that became a thing, copper plate engraving. They made a point of saying this is not on steel, made it somehow more valuable. But of course, because the copper plate was probably steel-faced, no one knew that. So they can still call it a copper plate engraving. And
it's genuine simulated copper plate engraving.
It's a kind of amalgam, the different metals. But so when Mezzotint became, fell out of favor, it wasn't really useful to anybody. Nobody knew what to do with it or how to make it anymore because the apprentice system was gone. But when the painter-etcher people took it up, they weren't steel-facing because, they were happy if they got 2-3 good impressions. They were just doing it for creative exploration and, they were happy if they got a few.
Creative exploration is a lovely way to put the amateurs, those who were doing it for the love of it.
Short. Frank Short, he was no amateur. And, he revived Mezzotint technique so that he could continue, so JMW Turner originally wanted to do 100 prints combining etching and Mezzotint to reproduce his pen and ink drawings, very much like the Liber Veritatis of Claude Lorraine. And so he did the Liber Studiorum, but he only did 71 of the 100 planned images. So Frank Short, after Turner's death, used Mezzotint, revived it to finish out the series, what Turner had planned to do. And so there was a revision there of how to do this. And, he passed it on to this person, passed it on to that person.
All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to cut it off for this week. Sorry. There's still quite a long way to go. So thank you for listening to this episode of Platemark with Carol Wax and True Ludwig as our special guest interviewer. Carol's amazing, and you should all buy her book. The second edition of the Mezzotint History and Technique came out at the end of last year, and it is well worth the purchase. You can find it wherever you find books. If you like Amazon, you can find it there. If you don't like Amazon, you can find it independent. Okay, as usual, I need to send out thank yous to various people. Well, one, obviously, to Carol for being such a good sport, and two, to True for sitting on the call with us, and one to Dan Fury of Extension Audio for helping me with sound. We had some issues this time around. Thank you, Dan. And also to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. If you appreciate the content that we're producing at Platemark, please consider going over to platemarkpodcast.com and pressing the support and donate button. Your assistance would be most appreciated.